All right, what's going on, guys? Welcome to today's episode. I'm sitting down with Gabrielle Fundaro. So this is, I believe, your second time on the podcast. And every now and then, even though that was quite a while ago, I still get comments and questions about that episode. And so people really, really loved what you had to say. I think especially in the bodybuilding and kind of like, powerlifting community, a lot of people talk about performance, but not a whole lot of people just talk about how you feel. And especially for bigger powerlifters, that's a big issue, is just always feeling bloated and things like that. So I know the first episode was really, really great, really well received. And I'm really excited because today we're going to talk a little bit more in that similar kind of vein. We're going to be talking about improving digestion, bloating, and just kind of an upset stomach and things like that. So first off, Gabrielle, thank you so much for jumping on. It's great to have you here.
Oh, it's great to be back. Thank you. I'm always appreciative of the fact that people are interested in what I have to say, or at least tolerant of it.
So can you give a little bit of a background of yourself? I know kind of a lot's going on right now, but just for people who maybe haven't heard the first episode or aren't necessarily familiar with you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm known around Instagram, at least, as a person who talks about gut health. I have my PhD in the area of the gut microbiome and human metabolism. So I studied probiotic supplementation and its effects on metabolism during high-fat feeding. And before that, I got my bachelor's in exercise, sport, and health education. So after I finished my doctorate, I didn't really intend to do much in the gut microbiome world because that was 2014 and no one was really talking about it yet. So I went on to teach exercise science and sport nutrition and a lot of anatomy and physiology to exercise science and pre-nursing students for 4 years out in Georgia. And in my, I think, third year of teaching, that's when Mike from RP stumbled upon me in the ISSN Facebook group and recruited me to RP. I was an RP coach for 4 years and some change. It was incredible. I had the opportunity to speak nationally and internationally about gut health. And I ended up finishing the gut health science book this year. And so RP is in charge of like marketing and selling that. And so it's pretty cool to, be able to reach a few different audiences in that way. And this year I went on to my own coaching business 100%, and then started up with Examine as well. So I'm an Examine researcher, gut health science communicator, lifestyle coach, and also run the comprehensive coaching Facebook group and coach education side of things with my friend Shannon. So that's where I am now.
So a couple things you're talking
A little
about.
bit, yeah.
Awesome. So I guess just to kind of start off the discussion, can you give like a little bit of a broad description of gut health, what it is and what people are kind of talking about, and some of the common narratives around that right now?
Sure. I can't recall whether I had my working definition when we talked last, but I classically would answer this question with the non-answer of we really don't have a consensus definition of gut health. And that still is the case. So, we don't have a characteristic profile of at least microbiome that is considered to be the picture of health or of a healthy gut. But most of the time when people say the words gut health, I think that they're probably referring to one or all of three characteristics. One would be, and I call these the 3Ds of gut health. And I want to be very transparent. It's not a research term. It's something that I made up. But those 3Ds are diversity, disease, and digestion. So they're thinking about the diversity of their gut microbiome, the absence or effective management of functional and organic GI diseases, and then the sort of subjective and objective efficacy and comfort of their digestive process. And since that is gut health is an umbrella term, and even those three terms are sort of umbrella concepts that cover quite a lot. So that's why the idea of gut health is quite complex and hard to define.
No, that definitely makes sense. And so I guess we'll kind of start off with more of the easier ones that people usually experience, right? The bloating, the gastrointestinal issues, things like that, and heartburn. So what are some of the common reasons that people experience these things?
Well, so I'll be transparent again. Some of this is going to be sort of like a clinical perspective. So, me not being a gastroenterologist, none of this is intended to be diagnostic. But in terms of sort of the physiology of gas and bloating and indigestion, if we want to start with sort of the perceptions of gas and bloating, gas is produced by the microbes as they are fermenting whatever substrate they have present. And so they produce a variety of different gases: hydrogen, methane, hydrogen sulfide. And we normally are passing that throughout the day. And sometimes, though, we might feel a little bit bloated because we're not passing it easily. There might be some constipation issues. There might just be a lot of gas that's produced very quickly. Or someone may have irritable bowel syndrome. So they'll have a dysfunctional GI disease that either increases their perception of pain associated with the bloating, with the stretching from that gas production, or there could be some other factors that we haven't quite figured out yet that may modulate either the amount of gas produced or the regularity of the contractions of their GI tract. So there's some dysregulation there in the function, and then that leads to increased amount or perception of gas and bloating in the GI tract. Moving up toward the stomach, the reasons behind things like nausea and indigestion are still poorly understood. And some of the old beliefs about, ulcers or heartburn being caused by acid aren't really held up, with improvements in study designs and further research. So there are a lot of different factors. There could be psychological factors, things like stress, and just other troubling emotions. It could be that a person has a non-IgE mediated food allergy that's causing some immediate and severe GI distress. Or it could be that they're lactose intolerant and they're having dairy and they're having a difficult time breaking that down. So there really are, or it could be that they're, have eaten something that's way out of date because they meal prepped last week and they don't want to throw it out, and so they eat it, and that's a little bit off.
No, that definitely makes a lot of sense. And you mentioned one thing that I personally am really, really interested in, which is kind of like the psychological aspects of that and how they sort of influence each other. So, what sort of relationship does stress have with gut health, with feeling like discomfort, bloating, things like that? And how does that relationship kind of, I guess, reciprocally affect one another as well?
Mm. That area is still very poorly understood, and the vast majority of research done on the gut-brain axis has so far been done in rodents, or there have been just sort of a low enrollment like brain imaging scans. So like someone has a probiotic drink, and then we scan their brain and we look at what areas light up. So the practical applications are still very limited. What we've gathered from rodent studies thus far, though, is that the microbiome does play a role in brain development. So in rodents that are reared without any microbiome, overall, they develop abnormally. So their immune systems, their skeletal muscle, just everything they don't seem to thrive. They don't develop normally. And the same goes for brain development. But that doesn't really translate to humans because no human is ever born without exposure to microbes, either vaginally or on the skin. So humans are never developing without some set of microbes. But it gives us sort of a mechanistic insight, okay? Like they probably play some role in the development of the brain and nervous system. The other thing that we can gather from rodents is looking at fecal transplant studies. So fecal matter is transplanted either from another rodent or from a human donor into an empty mouse, so one that was either raised germ-free or one that had its microbiome pretty much wiped out by antibiotics. And after that is done, researchers will observe the behavior of the mice, and they might assess them for anxiety-like behaviors or depression-like behaviors or autism-like behaviors. So again, there's a potential mechanism there because they can observe behavioral changes, but once again, the translation to humans is very limited because I think we would probably agree that mice don't experience depression, anxiety, or other states like humans do. And so they're really just a proxy. And again, it's just to look at sort of like potential mechanisms. Is there a potential relationship here? So what we would need to do to be able to determine, a potential cause and effect relationship would be to do this with specific microbes of interest based on observational studies, and then replicate those studies in humans. So while we do sometimes see pattern of microbiome profiles in individuals with anxiety and depression and autism spectrum disorder, there's so much inter-individual variability that we still don't have like one, this is a microbiome of depressed people. All depressed people have, share these microbes, and so we can transplant those. So that's just to give you an idea of sort of where we are in that area of research, which is like not very far. That being said, there is a really high rate of co-occurrence in depression, anxiety, and irritable bowel syndrome. So that does look like there is some sort of relationship here, or at least there's a correlation, between these disease states. And one of the actually effective interventions for alleviating some of the symptoms of IBS is cognitive behavioral therapy. And actually gut-directed hypnotherapy is emerging in the literature as well as something that could be potentially beneficial. So it could be that people who are undergoing CBT and this gut-derived hypnotherapy are changing their perception of the pain signals that they're receiving. So like the signaling is the same, but their perception is different. Or maybe it's helping them feel less stressed. And so there is better, there's less sympathetic nervous system tone and maybe better blood flow to the intestine. And that helps to, improve the environment of the cells, easier time delivering oxygen and taking away waste. So things like that, because we do have this large vagus nerve that regulates about 75% of our parasympathetic nervous system tone. So that's like the rest and digest system. And they have observed bidirectional communication between the gut and the brain. And the microbes can ostensibly interact with the neurons as well. And then the gut really has its own sort of second brain, this enteric nervous system as well. But, they're all communicating either centrally or peripherally. But it's just trying to unravel that relationship. That's what we're still trying to work on.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. And I mean, I guess part of that could literally even be, and I mean, feel free to correct me if I might be wrong on this, but part of the CBT and the impact that could have as well is like even just maybe directing awareness around maybe eating behaviors or certain patterns that you might notice that precede, let's say, an episode or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Crazy. Yeah, that's really, really interesting. So what are some of the strategies that you usually go through with, let's say, a client's brand new, they've been experiencing these issues for a while, and haven't really seen any success? They go to you. What are some of the starting points that you like to kind of take them through?
That's such a good question, because I think it's an opportunity to highlight that sometimes what we attribute to, a quote unquote bad gut health is really a result of, many years of continuous dieting, very restrictive diets, or diets that are really high in sort of like the classical health halo foods and diet foods that contain ingredients that cause GI distress. And so one of the initial steps is to help a person, identify their dietary patterns and habits, and kind of what's behind them, to look for areas where they feel comfortable making change. And so some of this can center around just energy balance. So kind of like, are you really constipated, or have you just been eating only 1,000 calories a day for the last 6 months? And, yes, you're constipated, but it's not that it's something necessarily that you're eating or something wrong with your gut. It's just that you have been chronically dieting for so many months, and your GI system motility will be reduced in that state. And maybe you've also been eating super, super high volume food, tons and tons of fibrous vegetables. And so you're taking in 80 grams of fiber per day. And, even if you're hydrating adequately, that could potentially cause some constipation. Or are you feeling super gassy because you're eating an incredibly high FODMAP diet, which isn't necessarily bad or wrong. It's just something that, we're kind of sold as like, this is a super healthy, nutritious diet and you need to be eating avocado and broccoli and all these other things that are super gas promoting. So helping a person just understand, the impact these foods have on our GI tract and why, and that it's not necessarily harmful or bad. It's just our microbes metabolizing the nutrients that are available to them. And also helping them understand the relationship between things like energy balance, exercise, and lifestyle on things like gas and bloating and bowel regularity. And of course, all this comes after, we've gone through the standard, like visiting a gastroenterologist and getting screened for the actual presence or absence of disease. And once they have a clean bill of health, then it's, kind of the green light on, let's look at some dietary changes that could help you feel more comfortable.
Awesome. And so that kind of leads into my next question, I guess, with sort of diagnostic tools. There's a lot of stuff out there that's being touted as being really effective. So like food elimination diets, scratch tests, food allergy tests, different things like that. So which ones of these tests, well, first of all, I guess, could you maybe highlight some of the more popular ones that are usually talked about? And then, just discuss which ones are validated, which ones haven't necessarily been validated, and what people can do to make sure they're not necessarily wasting their time and money on some of these processes.
Absolutely. Yeah. So there are valid clinical, as you mentioned, diagnostic and screening tools for known diseases. So for example, a person could go and have a colonoscopy and that can identify polyps, colorectal cancer. They could have a biopsy done that could identify microscopic colitis. So that's a valid diagnostic tool. They could also look at blood markers like fecal calprotectin. So that's one that can help identify the presence of an inflammatory bowel disease. So pretty much the things that you're going to have done at a gastroenterologist, they're going to take a look at your symptoms because there are things like the Rome 3 criteria as a screening tool for IBS. They're going to look at your symptoms. They might then order some diagnostic or screening tests and try to rule out, diseases. So when people sometimes people have the idea or the perception that like IBS is not a diagnosis, right? It's just they've ruled everything else out and all I got was, this shitty t-shirt, I've got IBS. But in fact, IBS has told you what's going on, that you don't have an organic disease. It's not a disease of the tissues. There is a dysfunction in the physiology of your GI tract, and that can be managed. That can be managed through pharmaceutical means and through diet and lifestyle. So you do have an answer and you have some potential interventions. Just that your gastroenterologist might not be the person to guide you through the low FODMAP diet or to help you with lifestyle modifications. So just kind of keeping that in mind, because what can happen is that people feel maybe invalidated or like they're not being heard or like this diagnosis doesn't make sense to them with what they're experiencing. And so they leave the gastroenterologist and they go to some alt medicine practitioner. And that's where you can really run into the red flags of invalid, non-clinically relevant tests. And some of them are very obvious. Sometimes, if a person, pokes on your stomach and they hear some gurgling and they say, oh, that's candida. Most people will say, that seems a little bit fishy. What gets really confusing and what can be very easy to market as scientific are things like the IgG food sensitivity test or Dutch test or GI map tests that come looking like they have reference ranges, like they are clinically relevant, like they're actual diagnostic tools. And indeed, they are measuring things in a valid way, in the sense that like validity is just that the test is measuring what it says it's going to measure. So you go get an IgG food sensitivity test, and that test did indeed measure your IgG antibody levels. But it's the interpretation of the test that matters and that makes it misleading and inaccurate and potentially harmful. So in the case of an IgG food sensitivity test, practitioners are interpreting that level of IgG antibody as a problematic immune response and a sign of a food sensitivity. And then they're telling people to eliminate those foods. And in fact, that IgG antibody is a recognition antibody. It is a tolerance antibody. It's just showing that this person habitually eats this food and that their immune system has recognized that it is not an intruder. It's not a pathogen. So then these people eliminate their habitual foods and they're left with 10 foods that they can eat. So maybe their caloric intake goes down. Maybe by chance they reduce their FODMAP intake and so their GI symptoms resolve. But quite often, they don't feel any better. And now they're really confused because they eliminated all of these foods and they don't feel that much better. And now they're very low energy and they have a headache and they feel brain fog. Well, then what happens? They get diagnosed with candida or adrenal fatigue. Is it really that? Or do you have brain fog because you're eating 700 calories a day? So that's where these can be really, really harmful. Or the case of the GI map test, where companies set arbitrary reference ranges of microbes, and then these practitioners are using these tests of those as a diagnostic tool. Oh, you have too much streptococcus and not enough Akkermansia. And they act as though we can precisely modify microbes. And that is really not the case. And so once again, people are misled and potentially missing a serious diagnosis or potentially missing a relatively simple, non-invasive modification to their diet and lifestyle that they didn't have to spend $300 to figure out.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense. And I've had clients, and even actually one of my sisters has celiac disease, and she's had a battle of this for many, many years as well. Seeing different specialists, seeing different people who've prescribed her a whole host of different tests and different things like that just have not worked and have made things worse. And it's kind of funny actually, because a lot of that sounds really similar to kind of the paradigm in training with personal trainers, where they overvalue maybe positions or injuries, they blow things up. So it's oh, you have anterior pelvic tilt, which means that you're going to have low back pain and this and this and this, and they overdiagnose people. So now they're scared to move, and because they're scared to move, they're not exercising. Now because they're scared to exercise, their tissue tolerance is going down, and it's just they're actually more susceptible to injury in some cases. And so it's it almost is this self-creating problem at times. And especially if someone is a doctor, if they are a naturopathic doctor, it's oh, well, they went to school, they're a doctor, and now you're well, I can't trust anyone anymore. And so it's really, really dangerous. That was something, like I said, my sister went through, and it's been very, very difficult for her as well. So that makes a lot of sense. So what sort of impact does, let's say, exercise have on gut health?
Well, on gut health, that might be a little bit of a different answer from looking at the gut microbiome or GI distress. So I'll kind of go piece by piece. In terms of microbial diversity, we actually only have 2 studies on deck at the moment that looked at the effects of physical activity and controlled for four. And only 2 of those actually found a direct relationship between physical activity and the microbiome. And so right now, most of the data is looking just at endurance athletes or kind of sport athletes, so rugby players and soccer players. But for the most part, we're looking at cyclists and runners. And B, like I mentioned, we're not controlling for diet. So in many cases, these athletes and even recreational exercisers, they might be eating a diet that looks different from the sedentary counterparts because they might be eating more complex carbohydrates, higher protein, and so on. But it looks like, from what we can tell from a few studies that have actually done interventions, that there is some relationship between fitness level, cardiovascular fitness level, and just physical activity in general, and microbial diversity, in that we tend to have higher microbial diversity and more butyrate producers in people who are physically active. So that's kind of interesting. And there's a pretty cool study done in 2020 that looked at probiotic supplementation in bodybuilders. And the probiotics really didn't do anything, but what was really interesting was that they found, sort of on accident, that the bodybuilders who ate a very high protein, low fiber diet, their microbial diversity was not any different from the sedentary controls. And those that did eat adequate fiber, they had the elevated level of diversity that we would sort of expect to see. So that lends to the idea that it might be really important for us to get adequate fiber along with our physical activity to support a diverse group of microbes.
That's pretty wild. So is that during contest prep or is that off season?
Well, they didn't say like where they were in their training cycle, but they basically just like their intervention was to have them eat a very high protein, like low carb diet, or one that was more like moderate protein. They called it sort of a prudent diet. Mm-hmm. And then they compared them to the sedentary controls. So, but it is sort of indicative of, like late in prep, people are usually not eating, many complex carbohydrates. They may be eating fibrous vegetables, but, the microbes are a little bit picky about which type of dietary fiber they're going to utilize for energy. And they really aren't utilizing cellulose, which is kind of the primary fiber that we'll get in like lettuce and whatnot. So, it's just something to think about. And, but again, we don't know what the clinical implications of that are. Like, what does it mean if you have higher microbial diversity? And, does that matter as much as just the functional diversity? Because what we do tend to see also is that even if we lose groups of microbes, like there's a change in the taxonomy and just the population, we don't necessarily lose functionality because other microbes can do the same thing, so there's like a level of redundancy. So that still remains to be seen, whether and how much that matters.
That's wild, man. Like the more that you learn about the body, the more you're like, man, these are pretty perfectly engineered machines.
Seriously, it's like, wow, like how is this all happening kind of on accident and it's okay. So that was pretty interesting to look at just sort of like the influence of, potentially the influence of physical activity on the microbiome. In terms of its effects on digestion, we do have a little bit more data, again, on endurance athletes, indicating that really high intensity endurance exercise, especially in the heat, tends to increase markers of intestinal permeability and intestinal damage. So most of the time we're looking at things like zonulin or circulating endotoxin. So if you are that type of athlete, it behooves you to take in adequate hydration and like some form of carbohydrate beverage because that seems to help. But again, it could be just like we see that post-workout inflammatory cascade, and suppressing that is problematic. Is it really an issue if we see this post-exercise change in intestinal permeability, or is it just a normal part of our acute, response to exercise and then it subsides on its own? So we don't really know that, but there is a sort of a phenomenon, this exercise-induced gastrointestinal syndrome, that tends to affect females more frequently than males and tends to affect endurance athletes more so than resistance trained athletes. And it really is just characterized by diarrhea and sort of abdominal pain that occurs after an intense bout of endurance exercise. As far as resistance training, I'm collaborating with a faculty member out in Tennessee, and we are actually looking into the effects of an intense resistance training bout on markers of GI damage and permeability and subjective GI distress in male and female collegiate athletes, along with gut microbiome data, I should say fecal microbiome data, to see if we can start parsing out some of those relationships.
That'll be really interesting to see when that comes out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're in the data analysis phase right now. So it's interesting because we've met and kind of looked at the preliminary data. We don't have the gut microbiome data yet. So we've got like a bioinformatics company that's helping us with that. But we do see some pretty significant differences based on both gender and 1 rep max and, correlates with permeability and GI distress. So we're going to just work on like kind of normalizing the data so we can get, is there an effect of if we look at like %1 or like we look at 1 rep max, based on like percent as a percentage of body weight and things like that. So it'll be really interesting to see because so far only one other study has looked at anything similar. And they found that after an intense bout of, I think it was just leg press, they actually did see reduced absorption of post-workout protein. So that was kind of interesting to see.
Hmm. I guess it seems kind of surprising to me.
Yeah, that it would happen that fast. Like one, but like do some
Yeah.
intense leg press, and then your GI tract is all like, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, especially like given certain nutrient timing considerations, right? Like you would imagine that like protein utilization and I guess transport would be improved during that period. Um, so you mentioned hydration a moment ago. So looking at hydration, because I know a lot of people struggle with that. What sort of impact does hydration have on just proper gut health?
There hasn't been quite a lot on just like looking at, general hydration, like in sedentary populations and whatnot. Obviously, dehydration could lend to constipation. If you have an improper osmolarity of the drink that you're having, like say you had like tons and tons and tons of fructose in your beverage, or even just tons of sugar, and that was a much higher concentration than the contents of your intestine. Water follows solute, so that means that the water would be potentially attracted to your intestine, be pulled into the lumen of the intestine, and that could lead to diarrhea. So just like very loose stool because you've taken in a beverage that's too concentrated, and now that water is being pulled into the lumen, and you've got some runner's trots, as they like to say, very adorably. But the other thing is that it probably contributes to difficulty regulating core temperature. And it looks like heat stress, and then, in combination with the hypoxic or low oxygen environment that happens because blood is being shunted away from the intestinal tract, that can lead to the generation of reactive oxygen species. So those can cause some cell damage, could potentially change things like pH, and that can influence the activity of microbes. Whether that matters so much over the course of a couple hours is still questionable. There's been one study that I can recall looking at elite endurance athletes, and they did measure the microbiome in terms of functionality before and after their marathon. And there was a change in functionality even in those couple of hours. If memory serves me correctly, there was like the microbes were, or the gene expression. So they weren't doing quite as much like energy metabolizing, and they were doing a little bit more in terms of like flagellar assembly or something. So I like to think of them being like, oh, we're being jostled around, and like, let's work on like improving the strength of our flagella so we can stay where we want to be. But that's just me making things up. We don't really know what was going on, but it is interesting to see that, potentially like there are changes that are occurring even in the short term.
Yeah, that's pretty wild. And so for individuals who are experiencing, let's say, either loose stool or constipation, like what are some of the main things you look at in either case to help correct that?
I say go to a gastroenterologist if you haven't been to one already. But but in all seriousness, after that, usually looking at just the basics of energy balance first off, because if a person is, like I said, been chronically undereating, that can quite often contribute to constipation. And there is a fairly high co-occurrence also of the perception of constipation and bloating with eating pathology. So just something to keep in mind, that it can be sometimes a red flag. Sometimes people are perceiving themselves as feeling very bloated, when in fact they just are not used to normal postprandial fullness and distension. So that's something to consider. Second to that would be looking at, the kind of like the FODMAP content of their diet. So looking at things like, if they're eating, FODMAP stands for fermentable oligodimmonosaccharides and polyols. So we're looking at, fructose, which is obviously found in a ton of fruits. There are FODMAPs that are pretty ubiquitous in vegetables as well. So things like cauliflower, mushrooms, avocado, and then things like beans, whole grain. So there are plenty of foods that are wholesome and nutritious, considered to be like whole foods, but a person might have a dietary pattern that's really, really high in FODMAPs, and they're experiencing loose bowel movements and bloating and gas because of that. And in that case, some education around FODMAPs, potentially guidance through the low FODMAP process, because it's not intended to be a long-term diet. And looking also at things like the common food allergens, Although again, people can actually visit an allergist and be screened for potential allergens. They're not diagnostic tests, but it's something else to keep in mind that you could visit a gastro, visit an allergist, kind of get those things ruled out, get a sense of what potentially could be going on. And then from there, a systematic process of elimination and reintroduction of foods that make sense to eliminate and reintroduce. And then, kind of fine tuning from there. In most cases, about 70% of individuals do respond to a low FODMAP diet. The rest may not respond because, maybe something like went wrong. Maybe they ate some FODMAPs on accident. And some people just tend to not respond. And there's some evidence illustrating that it could be due to kind of like their unique set of microbes that, there's something else going on for them. And maybe one day, we'll be able to predict a person's potential response to the diet based on their microbial profile. But again, that's still really early on. But, and other things like, is a person eating a lot of like, protein bars and protein shakes and taking in a ton of sugar alcohols? That's a pretty obvious culprit as well.
No, that makes sense. And so for a lot of the people listening to this are probably going to have either strength-based goals or, muscle-based goals, wanting to get bigger. I don't know a whole lot of people who really follow me who are looking to get smaller. Yeah, so for those individuals, I know that sometimes eating enough to actually gain weight can be a little bit problematic because, if you're doing a good job getting enough fruits and veggies in, that can be quite a bit of food volume just on its own. And then you've got to get in, your rice or potatoes or whatever else it is. And that can, collectively accumulate quite a bit in your stomach and just kind of cause some bloating, some discomfort. So do you have any sort of strategies to either reduce or effectively manage bloating and discomfort while simultaneously still having a good, well-balanced diet of like whole foods and really nutrient dense foods?
Yeah, it's really just about balance, meeting the recommendations for those whole foods, your 5 a day of fruits and veggies, but then also keeping in mind that there's, we're looking really at entire dietary patterns. There's not going to be like one food that is inherently deleterious to health. And so it might be appropriate for a person to switch up their whole grain bagels or their whole grain bread for refined carbohydrates, especially when we're looking at pre, peri, and post workout. If you want to, if you really want to, set yourself on fire in the gym, have a whole grain, plenty of fructose and lots of fat before your workout, and you'll be on and off the platform pretty fast because you're going to have to run to the bathroom. So the things to really be careful with before you work out would be things like fiber, fat, and fructose, because those are going to really lead to some GI distress, if not having to take a pretty solid poop in the middle of your squat session. So in that case, have some gummy bears or, use some table sugar or some powdered lemonade in your workout beverage. And before you work out, go ahead and have a minimal fiber meal. Have the white bagel or pancakes, keeping fat and fiber and fructose low, or Pop-Tarts, although, those might be a little bit high in fructose if they've got high fructose corn syrup, but it might work for some people. So I think it's moving away from the idea of demonizing foods and saying well, that's just junk food that has no place in someone's diet. If you need to eat 4,000 calories a day, it might be really helpful for you to include some of those things. Or even taking foods that you could add to. So if you're having a sandwich, can you put some jelly on that sandwich? That's something that's going to be potentially higher in sugar. And then same thing with the post-workout meal. You might find that you feel more comfortable having refined carbohydrates. They're much more dense. They take up less volume in the stomach, and so it's easier to get them down. And same thing with something like liquid carbohydrates. You don't need to go buy an expensive mass gainer. You could just make that yourself with some sugar and, whey protein isolate or protein of your choice. But just those little modifications to make the same volume of food more energy dense, and then bias the high fiber foods to other times of the day when, you're not trying to kind of eat potential stomach discomfort.
Yeah, that was something for me anyways that I found to be pretty helpful. So um, I'm definitely the kind of person who I find that if I'm quite strict with my diet, I actually have zero issues. I don't get cravings. I don't ever feel temptations. Like I feel great. But then if I
Mhm.
try and do the whole 80-20 thing, that's usually when I start running into those like, kind of the ambivalence of
Mm,
like, I want the Oreos, but I also want this. And so I actually find it a lot easier to be a little bit more strict, and my quality of life is way better if I do that.
sure.
And so for me, I was eating a lot of whole foods.
Mhm.
I'm like 270 now. So I'm
Yeah.
I'm actually still cutting, but before when I was quite a bit bigger, um, yeah, I was mostly doing that just through whole foods. And I don't really take like supplements. I don't really drink protein shakes or anything like that. And so that's a lot of food to be eating. And
Sure.
for a while there, it was really tough. And one of the things that I did was, post workout, I'd have a big bowl of cereal, so
Mhm.
like Fruit Loops or something like that, really, really high carbohydrate. And that would make it so much easier because that would take like 150 grams of carbs off my plate just like that, you know?
Yeah.
And I'd be like, okay, yeah, I feel way better, just more stable energy throughout the day. And then having the peri-workout nutrition, having like some sort of dextrose drink or whatever, made a
Mhm.
huge difference in, I mean, also actually in my performance. I just felt like I wouldn't gas out halfway through.
Yeah.
So
Oh, yeah.
those little recommendations that you gave are like super helpful, or can be super helpful for a lot of people for sure. Um, so in terms of like just strategies to improve overall gut health, I know you kind of gone through quite a few of them here, but could you just kind of summarize a few good strategies that would help most people?
Yeah, sure. It's going to sound really basic. So I'll start with the most foundational things: engage in regular physical activity and eat a wide variety of plants. And that doesn't have to be vegetables, that's fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, um, plant-based meat products, or, not meat products, but soy, things like that. So eat a wide variety of plants, get regular physical activity. The next layer would be limit your use of alcohol. Moderate to low intake of red wine doesn't seem to be problematic, but in addition to that, just know that the benefits are not outweighed by the risks. And then things like abstaining from smoking, and only using drugs as recommended by your physician, especially when it comes to things like antibiotics, because antibiotic resistant microbes are really an issue that come from people kind of just abusing antibiotics. And then on top of that, if you want to add fermented foods to your diet, great. Just keep in mind that dairy is the only fermented food that is considered to be probiotic at the moment. Probiotic meaning that it contains live microbes that, when ingested, confer a benefit to the host. So kind of like save your money and whatnot, and stick to fermented dairy if that's something that you want to do. But aside from that, I mean, microbes, your microbiome is pretty stable. There's not much that you can do to completely obliterate it. Even if you're on antibiotics, it will revert to another sort of stable state afterwards. There can be targeted use of probiotics if you have some diarrhea associated with antibiotics or traveling, and potentially in folks with IBD and IBS, it could help with some of the symptoms. And peppermint oil is another evidence-based intervention for abdominal pain and IBS. So that's my hierarchy: physical activity, plenty of plants, limit alcohol, use drugs prudently, and if you want to supplement, use probiotics wisely and fermented dairy.
Awesome. So as far as probiotics go, are you those like over the counter, or are they like medical grade prescribed stuff?
They have medical food grade probiotics available, but most of the probiotics that you're going to get on the market are just going to be an over the counter form. So the medical food grade would be, it used to be called VSL3. Now I think VSL3 still exists, but there are other formulations, like something happened with the patent, but that was what I was studying. That was what I was using during my dissertation. So those are usually sold in extremely high doses, many tens of billions per packet, like 90 billion per packet, usually as an intervention for inflammatory bowel disease. And the stuff that you can get over the counter, something like an S. that's been shown to have efficacy with antibiotic-associated diarrhea. Other things like some of the bifido and lactobacilli strains are helpful for kind of like, some of the mild symptoms of IBS. But again, it's very person-specific. The effects are strain-specific. And the literature as a whole is really rife with, kind of poorly done studies, lack of replication, and a lot of heterogeneity that makes it hard to come up with a consensus statement about which strains might be best for what and how we should take them.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes sense. Awesome. So where can people find you?
At Vitamin PhD on Instagram and Facebook. I am, as I mentioned, I sell the Science of Gut Health ebook that I wrote with Dr. Jessie Hoffman, who also did her research in the area of the gut microbiome. They can find that on the RP website. And if they check out vitaminphdnutrition.com, they can find out how to work with me one-on-one for either lifestyle or gut health science inquiries.
Awesome. So all that stuff's going to be linked up in the show notes, guys. Make sure you go give her a follow and check out the book. What can people expect to get from reading the book?
So the book was intended to be a no BS, a very objective overview of the literature. So you can kind of think of it like a systematic review on steroids. So we cover an introduction to the microbiome, talking about the taxonomy and functionality of the microbiome and how we research it. And we talk about the process of digestion absorption and how the microbiome plays a role in that. So microbial metabolism of macronutrients, their role in metabolism, in mood, in GI diseases. We actually break down pretty much most of the main GI diseases and talk about some of the characteristic microbial differences in those between versus healthy people. We have a huge section on gut health pseudoscience as well. So things like candida, mold toxicity, IgG food sensitivity tests, SIBO. Some of it's completely made up. Some of it is pseudoscience that's sort of just kind of misrepresented. So really, it's a guide to what the research really says about the gut microbiome to ensure that people are making informed choices about, what supplements they want to use or what dietary pattern they might want to follow. And it also is very transparent about, what we don't know yet.
That's awesome. So again, that's going to be linked up in the show notes, guys. I ordered mine a while back. I haven't gotten to it yet because it's like I still got 3 more ahead of it, but I'm definitely looking forward to reading it. So thank you so much for jumping on the podcast. It was really great to have you on again.
It was a pleasure to be here. Thank you.